Capitol Hill trembled under a tension so sharp it felt like the walls could crack. Jasmine Crockett locked eyes with Chief Justice Roberts across the bench. In front of them, one anonymous audio file, no metadata, no chain of custody, yet powerful enough to destroy her in 47 minutes. But buried in the law was a 2018 precedent, sharp as a blade, ready to slice the case wide open. When the final gavel falls, will it be justice that stands or the accusation that crumbles? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. A steel gray winter morning wrapped Summit Heights Federal Courthouse in fog. Armed guards stood rigid on the steps as a long line of citizens and observers waited, their breath sharp in the cold. Then the doors opened. Jasmine Crockett walked in alone. No lawyer, no aide, just a thin file in her hand. Dark coat, steady eyes, each step deliberate. She cut through the murmurs without looking aside. Inside, every seat was filled, reporters poised, politicians whispering. Jasmine took her place at the defendant's table, still and unflinching. The side door opened. Chief Justice John Roberts entered, robe sweeping the floor, gaze sweeping the room, until it stopped on her. A faint, mocking smirk crossed his face, hanging there like a challenge. The room fell into a taut, waiting silence. The air in the room was already heavy from Robert's entrance, but now it seemed to solidify, pressing down on every shoulder. He took his time settling behind the bench, letting the black robe fold neatly around him, as if even the fabric understood its role in projecting authority. His eyes moved slowly across the courtroom, over the press, over the spectators, over the rows of politicians, before coming to rest on Jasmine Crockett. The pause was deliberate, the kind of pause that makes the room lean forward without realizing it. "Ms. Crockett," he said at last, his tone sharp enough to cut through the air. "This is a courtroom, not a White House press briefing." The words landed like a gavel strike, and the reaction was immediate. A low chuckle rippled through the gallery, quick and knowing, the kind of laugh that didn't just mock, it underlined the divide between the bench and the woman sitting before it. Roberts didn't blink. He leaned forward slightly, elbows brushing the polished wood, his voice sliding lower but growing colder. "I trust you won't turn today's proceedings into some cheap political monologue." This time, the laughter was louder, more confident, and a few lawmakers in the front row exchanged looks of satisfaction, as if the match had already been won before it began. Roberts let the sound swell for a moment before delivering the last blow. "And don't forget, you're here because you've been accused of breaking the law, not to teach me how to read it." The gallery erupted, not with applause, but with cruel amusement, the kind that cuts deeper because it feeds on public spectacle. Chairs creaked as people shifted to get a better view of Jasmine's reaction, but there was none to be found. She didn't flinch. Her gaze stayed fixed on the thin file in front of her, her hands steady on the table. She didn't look at the judge, the politicians, or the audience. The stillness itself became a statement, silent, unyielding, and sharper than any retort could have been. The laughter faded, but the tension remained, humming in the walls like a wire pulled too tight. The laughter from the gallery still clung to the air in thin, mocking strands, but it was already unraveling into a silence that felt brittle enough to snap. Into that silence, Prosecutor Elliot Drayton rose from the counsel table with the measured control of a man who knew the weight of the moment. His chair slid back without a sound, his steps slow but deliberate as he moved to the center of the well. He carried no notes in his hands, only the quiet assurance of someone who believed his case didn't need them. His shoulders were straight, his gaze steady, and while his voice emerged calm and even, there was an unmistakable undercurrent, every syllable sharpened with the intent to cut. "I will be brief," Drayton said, his voice even, his gaze fixed on the bench. "Ms. Crockett has violated the Hatch Act, a law designed to draw a strict boundary between public office and political ambition, forbidding any official from using their position to engage in political activity." He didn't raise his tone or pause for effect. The words came out clean, precise, as if the conclusion were already settled. To anchor his claim, Drayton turned the spotlight to a single remark, one he said had been made during a press conference on U.S. trade policy. He framed it not as a moment of policy explanation, but as a burst of partisan heat. His voice clipped the edges of the words, stripping them down to their most damaging form as he read, "They deserved it. Anyone who stands against America deserves the consequences." The quotation landed like a slap, abrupt and heavy, the ellipsis in the middle hanging there like a door slammed halfway shut, blocking the rest of the thought from view. He didn't give the room time to ask what was missing. Instead, he reached into his inside pocket and produced a small, unmarked USB drive, holding it up between his fingers so the overhead lights caught its metallic edge. "This," he said, his voice lowering slightly, "was provided by an anonymous source." The phrase itself carried its own kind of charge. Anonymous meant shadowy, secretive, potentially dangerous, and it rippled through the benches in a wave of shifting posture and hushed whispers. Drayton walked it over to the clerk, who took the drive with a neutral expression. The soft click of the USB slot locking in seemed louder than it should have, a metallic punctuation that drew the gallery's collective attention to the screens and speakers. A brief hiss of static filled the room, followed by Jasmine's unmistakable voice, crisp and firm. "They deserved it. Anyone who stands against America deserves the consequences. And if they think we will stand here, hands tied, while they undermine everything we have built, they are mistaken." It was her voice, but carved down to something harder, more unyielding than her usual tone. The warmth was gone, the cadence altered by the absence of full context, leaving only steel and finality. Without the rest of her remarks, it sounded like defiance sharpened into a challenge. The gallery reacted in small but telling ways, a tilt of the head here, a slow shake there, eyes narrowing as the words sank in. Near the front, two lawmakers exchanged a glance. And in that silent exchange was the unspoken verdict. She went too far. The murmurs started small, just a thread of sound running beneath the recording, but they thickened quickly, pulling more of the room into their current. The longer the clip played, the more it began to feel like the prosecution's framing had already taken root. The audio itself was short, less than a minute, but the pauses between her sentences seemed to stretch, giving space for judgment to bloom. When the playback ended with a faint click, the silence that followed wasn't neutral. It was charged, laced with the certainty that something had just shifted. The air felt hotter, denser, the kind of heat that clings and doesn't let go. Around the room, more than a few faces carried the look of people who believed they had just heard enough to convict. And in that moment, it didn't matter that no defense had been mounted yet. The accusation had already landed, and it had landed hard. The final click of the audio file seemed to echo longer than it should have, hanging in the tense airs until Roberts shifted in his seat, his hand lifted, not rushed but deliberate, granting Jasmine the floor. All eyes followed her as she pushed back her chair and stood. She gathered the slim, neatly arranged file in front of her, her fingers closing around it with a quiet precision that spoke of control, not nerves. Each step toward the lectern was unhurried, her heels striking the polished floor in a steady rhythm that carried across the hushed room. When she reached the center, she set the file down but did not open it. Instead, she let it rest beneath her fingertips, her gaze lifting to sweep over the room. She didn't glance at Roberts first, nor at the prosecution. Her eyes moved deliberately across the gallery, taking in the press, the politicians, the onlookers who had leaned forward to witness what came next. There was no twitch, no shift in posture, only the steady alignment of her shoulders and the quiet defiance in her stance. Her voice, when it came, wasn't raised. It didn't need to be. It carried a clarity and weight that cut through the space like the edge of a blade. "If this is a play, congratulations to the prosecution, but we are in a court of law." The words landed without hurry, each one given room to breathe, and the effect was instant. The scattered whispers that had been buzzing at the edges of the gallery faded, replaced by a tense stillness. In that silence, even the sound of pens stopping mid-note was audible. A reporter lowered his camera. A row of politicians in the front froze in their seats, eyes fixed on her as though a misstep might still come, but hadn't yet. At the bench, Roberts' expression shifted almost imperceptibly. His eyes narrowed, the lines at the corners tightening, but he made no reply. He only watched her, and in the unbroken quiet, it was clear the balance in the room had shifted. Not with volume, but with precision. With her opening line still cutting through the quiet, Jasmine let the pause work for her before lowering her gaze to the file. Her fingers slid over the paper as if she were weighing every word before speaking it aloud. Then, with the precision of someone laying down bricks, she began. The Hatch Act prohibits using official authority or influence to affect the outcome of an election. Her tone was deliberate, every word distinct, each syllable landing with a weight that demanded the room's attention. She turned the page, eyes steady, and continued. It prohibits soliciting or receiving political contributions while on duty in a federal building or using official resources. The clauses fell into place like steps in a staircase, each one lifting her argument higher. She did not rush. The cadence was unbroken, almost surgical. It prohibits engaging in campaign activity in an official capacity or while wearing the authority of the office. Here, she let her voice slow half a beat before looking up, her gaze sweeping from the bench to the prosecution's table. It regulates campaigning, not governing, not policy briefings, not the delivery of executive or legislative updates. The words "not governing" were sharper, as if meant to slice through the charge itself. A press conference on trade policy is a policy report, she said, leaning slightly into the microphone. Not an ask for votes, not a fundraiser, and not a call to support a candidate. The repetition was intentional, hammering the distinction into the record. She tapped the margin of the document once, controlled, deliberate, and read again from the statute, syllable by syllable. No use of official authority for electoral advantage, no fundraising on duty, no political activity in the workplace. By now, the room was still. The line she had drawn between the act's intent in the prosecution's claim was no longer abstract. It was bright, sharp, and impossible to ignore. The pens that had stilled earlier began to scratch again, reporters capturing every clause. And from the bench, Roberts' eyes narrowed. Not with the earlier condescension, but with a focus that signaled he was now listening to more than just the words. The law was no longer a weapon in the prosecution's hands. Jasmine had pulled it back into her own. Having drawn the statutory line with precision, Jasmine let her hand rest on the file for a moment before lifting a single page from within, a certified transcript marked with timestamps and an official seal in the corner. The paper caught the overhead light as she laid it flat on the lectern, turning it so both the bench and the gallery could see the clean, black text. Her finger found the contested sentence instantly, and she tapped it once. Not hard, but with enough weight to draw every eye to the spot. The version you heard, she began, her voice measured but edged with steel, was interrupted mid-thought by an ellipsis. She held the pause there, letting the word ellipsis sink in, not just a mark on a page, but a blade used to sever meaning. So for the record, here is the full sentence. She didn't glance down again. She read it from memory, each clause crisp and deliberate. They deserved it. Anyone who stands against America deserves the consequences, but our job is to lead, not to boast. The contrast between what the prosecution had played and what she had just spoken was immediate and jarring. Jasmine gave the room a second to feel that shift before she leaned in, her eyes cutting to the jury box and then back to the bench. That final clause changes everything, from a call for punishment to a call for responsibility. Deterrence anchored to duty, not chest thumping. Her tone didn't rise, but the impact rolled outward like a wave, pressing into the edges of the gallery. Her hand slid along the margin of the transcript, stopping at the heading where the record identified the event as a policy briefing on trade enforcement, not a campaign rally, not a fundraiser. This was a trade policy update, she said firmly. Facts, enforcement, next steps, not a campaign pitch. Then, with the precision of a surgeon marking the incision, she traced the ellipsis with her pen, circling it slowly. Context isn't decoration, she said, locking eyes with Drayton across the room. It's meaning. Around her, the room's energy shifted again. Cameras lowered a fraction. Reporters who had been still now scratched, hurried notes. In the gallery, a few heads tilted, expressions softening into something more contemplative, the earlier certainty cracking under the weight of the missing words. Jasmine didn't move to fill the silence. She let the full sentence breathe on the record, intact, complete, and unflinching. The prosecution's cut had been neat. Her restoration was surgical. And in that moment, the wound was visible to everyone. With the full sentence restored to the record, Jasmine let the weight of that correction settle before shifting her stance. Her eyes moved to the prosecution's table, then to the small, unmarked USB drive still plugged into the evidence port, its metal edge catching the light like something exposed. "Now," she said, her voice dipping into a harder register, "let's talk about the recording you heard." She turned slightly toward the bench, raising a hand in its direction without touching it. No metadata, no timestamp, no chain of custody, an anonymous drop with no way to verify who recorded it, when it was recorded, or whether it was altered. Each point was delivered as if it were its own gavel strike, distinct and final. In every legal standard we operate under, that makes it unreliable, and in many, outright inadmissible. Her fingers moved with precision, flipping to a section of her binder marked by colored tabs. She slid one page free and read aloud, her voice steady but edged. United States v. Ramirez, 2014, digital audio with no verifiable chain of custody deemed inadmissible. She turned another tab. Jenkins v. State, 2018, anonymous recordings without authentication excluded from trial. She looked up briefly from the page, letting her eyes sweep the gallery before landing squarely back on Roberts. The rules for evidence don't change depending on who's sitting at this table. The binder closed with a muted thud, the sound carrying in the stillness. In the benches, a few observers leaned back, nodding slowly as if replaying the prosecution's earlier claims against the standards she had just cited. The shift in posture was subtle but telling. People who had been leaning forward in judgment now sat in quiet reassessment. At the prosecution's table, Drayton's jaw tightened, his lips pressing into a thin line, a crease etching deeper between his brows. The gallery's murmur was gone, replaced by a taut quiet in which her words seemed to keep echoing, each precedent like a crack in the foundation of the case against her. The last case she cited was still hanging in the air when Jasmine turned toward the bench. She didn't rush. She moved slowly, deliberately, until she was facing Roberts head on, her shoulders squared, her eyes locked on his, and when she spoke, her voice was calm but sharp enough to slice through the quiet. "If we accept an anonymous file as evidence, this is no longer a court of law." She paused just long enough for the words to sink in. "It is a political stage." The line hit hard, drawing a clear line in the air between justice and theater. She didn't let the moment fade. In Jenkins v. U.S. Civil Ethics Commission, 2018, the court made it clear, the Hatch Act can't just be stretched to fit any story someone wants to tell. It's not a catch-all net for anything an official says. It has one purpose, to stop actual campaigning with the power of an office. In Jenkins, the court threw out the case because strong policy talk is not political activity under the Act. She pointed at the USB drive. A file with no metadata, no timestamps, no verified source, there's no legal ground for it. And a sentence chopped in half by an ellipsis? That's not evidence. That's manipulation. The Hatch Act is meant to police campaigning, not punish governance, and definitely not to weaponize half-truths. Roberts shifted in his chair. It wasn't much, but the smirk from earlier was gone. He leaned forward slightly, eyes narrowing, not with mockery this time, but focus. For the first time, he wasn't just hearing her. He was listening. Her last words seemed to hang in the air, stretching the silence until it became a presence of its own. The transformation in the room was absolute. No whispers, no chuckles, no shifting in seats. The tension was so complete that the only sound was the faint, methodical tap of the clerk's pen against the desk, each beat amplifying the weight of what had just been said. Roberts leaned back slowly in his chair, the leather creaking under his movement, his hand rising to his forehead in a gesture that was less fatigue than calculation. His other hand reached for the transcript Jasmine had submitted earlier, the papers whispering against each other as he drew them closer. He opened it without haste, scanning the first page with deliberate care, his eyes moving line by line, pausing over certain passages as if measuring them against the words he had just heard. The smirk that had shadowed his face earlier was gone. In its place was a focused stillness, the set of his jaw tightening as his gaze deepened. By the time he reached the third page, his expression had shifted again, not to approval, not to judgment, but to a quiet, sharpened attention. When he finally looked up from the document, it was not toward Jasmine but directly at the prosecution's table. His voice was low even, but carried the authority of someone issuing a challenge that demanded truth. "Can you confirm the chain of custody for this recording?" The question hit like a cold hammer, reverberating in the still air. Drayton's posture stiffened, his eyes flickering for a moment before he replied, "We received it from an anonymous source." The pause before the words was enough to betray the weakness in the answer. The effect was immediate. A ripple moved through the gallery, not the restless murmur of earlier, but a sharper, more deliberate reaction. A few spectators let out quiet, knowing laughs, the kind that cut deeper than open mockery. It wasn't humor they were expressing. It was the recognition of a fault line in the prosecution's case, one that had just been exposed under the weight of a single question. The faint, uneasy laughter that had followed Drayton's weak reply had already faded into silence when Roberts leaned forward, resting both hands on the bench. His gaze swept the room slowly, pausing on the faces in the gallery, the prosecution, and finally, deliberately, on Jasmine. He let the quiet stretch until every ear in the chamber was tuned to him alone. When he spoke, his tone had shifted. It was no longer the clipped, almost dismissive voice from earlier, but one measured and deliberate, as if each word was being weighed before release. "Ms. Crockett," he began, the syllables landing one by one, "I thought I would hear a political defense." A few people in the front row leaned forward, expecting the sting of a rebuke. But Roberts didn't stop. His eyes didn't waver from hers. "But you have shown me a lesson in law." The sentence landed like a stone in still water, ripples of surprise moving across the room. Reporters glanced at each other, pens pausing in midair. Drayton's head shifted slightly, as if trying to process the turn the moment had taken. Roberts reached for the transcript lying open before him, his fingertips resting for a moment on the neat stack of pages. He tapped it once, not in irritation, but as though sealing its importance. Then he looked toward the clerk's desk. "The recording is excluded from the record." The statement was plain, but in a courtroom this tense, plainness could feel like thunder. It was a decision rooted in the points Jasmine had hammered home. No metadata, no timestamp, no verified source, no chain of custody. In legal terms, the file had no skeleton to stand on. The clerk nodded, making a quick notation, but the eyes of the room were fixed on Roberts. He straightened in his chair and shifted his attention back to the defendant's table. "The court finds Ms. Crockett not in violation of the Hatch Act." There was no hesitation in the phrasing, no room left for interpretation. He spoke as though the law itself had just spoken through him. His explanation followed, not for Jasmine alone, but for the record, for the reporters scribbling every syllable. "The act draws a line around campaigning. It does not criminalize governance. It does not forbid policy briefings. It does not turn the daily work of public service into political offense." As he said it, a few in the gallery exchanged glances, the significance sinking in. The very heart of the prosecution's case had been cut out, its edges cauterized by the ruling. The political theater some had expected to watch was gone. In its place stood the quiet gravity of law applied with precision. Roberts closed the transcript with a measured motion, his hand pressing lightly against the cover before pulling back. Then, almost as if breaking from his own formality, his eyes returned to Jasmine with something that wasn't quite a smile, but wasn't indifference either. "You have made me rethink my own understanding of this act." The words were simple, but they carried a weight that was felt as much as heard. Coming from the bench, it was more than acknowledgement. It was a concession that the clarity she had brought to the room had shifted his perspective. The courtroom didn't erupt. There was no applause, no outburst. But the silence that followed wasn't the brittle kind from earlier. It was full, charged, almost reverent. Even those who had walked in certain of her guilt seemed to recognize the shift. And as Roberts's gavel remained untouched, the absence of its strike was its own signal. The matter was closed, the ruling final, and the law, at least for this moment, had spoken with absolute clarity. The final words of Roberts' ruling still seemed to vibrate in the air, when Jasmine quietly gathered the slim file from the defense table. She didn't rush. She didn't move like someone who had just been handed a lifeline or a trophy. Every motion was deliberate, closing the file, sliding the chair back into place, adjusting the papers so their edges aligned. The bench, the gallery, even the prosecution's table watched her, but there was no gloating in her expression. The composure she'd walked in with that morning was the same composure she carried now, as if the verdict had not inflated her ego by a fraction. When she turned toward the courtroom doors, the air outside the legal arena waited for her like a storm pressing against glass. The moment she stepped past the last row of seats, the low hum of conversation in the hallway exploded into a wall of sound. Cameras snapped in rapid bursts, flashes igniting in her face from every angle. The corridor lined with reporters was already tightening into a funnel, each person jostling for a better position. Boom mics swayed overhead like fishing lines cast toward her. The first question didn't come gently. It cut through the din like a thrown stone. "Ms. Crockett, is this a political victory?" The voice was male, sharp, and carried the kind of tone that wasn't really asking, but framing a headline. The words were followed instantly by a crush of others, shouted over each other, overlapping until they became a single, pounding note of demand. "What do you say to your critics? Do you think this sets a precedent? Was this all just about politics?" Jasmine stopped. Not because she was cornered, she wasn't. Not because she needed a moment to collect herself, she didn't. She stopped because the question, the first one, was exactly the hook the crowd was hoping she would grab. She let the noise continue for a few seconds, long enough for the echo of the question to hang in the air, long enough for the front row of cameras to focus in tighter on her face. Then she turned slightly toward the direction the question had come from. Her voice, when it came, was not loud, but it cut through the noise like a knife through cloth. "No," she said, with a firmness that made the rest of the questions falter mid-breath. "This is a victory for the principle of the rule of law." The effect was immediate. The crowd stilled, not entirely, but enough that the sound dropped from a chaotic roar to a concentrated hum. The reporters in the front exchanged quick glances, some scribbling the line down verbatim, others already murmuring it into microphones for live feeds. A few stepped back, realizing they weren't going to get a soundbite dripping with politics or personal triumph. But Jasmine didn't move to capitalize on the moment. She didn't flash a smile, didn't gesture for more questions, didn't lean toward the microphones. Her posture remained the same, upright, steady, focused. Her gaze swept briefly across the press line, then past them, toward the courthouse steps and the clear strip of winter sky visible beyond. Behind her, the courthouse doors swung slowly closed, muffling the last remnants of the formal proceedings. In front of her, the cold air hit like a second verdict, sharp, bracing, unvarnished. She stepped forward once, twice, and the press instinctively shifted to follow, a tide of bodies and equipment moving in sync with her stride. Her answer, those 12 words, still hung in the air between them, a clean blade cutting away every attempt to drag the moment into the mud of politics. To some, it might have looked like restraint. To others, it was discipline. But for those who had watched the trial from start to finish, who had seen the way she dismantled the prosecution's case, point by point, it was something else entirely. It was consistency. The same control she had at the lectern, the same precision she had in parsing the Hatch Act, the same refusal to let half-truths stand, now distilled into a single sentence that shut down the narrative before it could take root. The cameras kept flashing, the microphones kept inching closer, but the dynamic had shifted. They were following her now, not pulling her. The decision to speak or not was hers alone, and they knew it. And as she continued down the courthouse steps, her breath curling in the cold morning air, the line she had just delivered began to take on a life of its own, passed from one reporter to another, repeated in the quick, clipped tones of broadcast producers. "This is a victory for the principle of the rule of law." She reached the bottom step without looking back. There was no need. The weight of the verdict was behind her, but the clarity of her words was already ahead of her, moving faster than any camera crew could follow. The noise of the press swelled again as they tried to pull her into new questions. But the only answer that mattered had already been given, and it was still echoing in the cold air. The cold morning outside the courthouse had barely faded from memory when the first spark hit the digital world. It didn't start with a press release or a headline. It started with a single video clip, cut with precision by someone who understood exactly which moment people would watch, rewatch, and pass along. The clip was tight, no wasted frames. Jasmine Crockett at the lectern, the transcript spread in front of her, her posture unshaken, her tone low but sharpened to the edge. There was no dramatic music, no fancy graphic overlays. It didn't need any. The words carried their own gravity. Viewers saw the stillness in the room, the way the gallery had gone silent, and then the way she said it, each syllable measured, each pause deliberate. That was the hook. It was the kind of footage that didn't shout for attention, but commanded it anyway. It started moving almost immediately. In the first 2 minutes after upload, it was picked up by a handful of accounts with followings big enough to matter. 5 minutes later, it was on the feeds of journalists and legal commentators who didn't even tag it. They just posted it raw, as if any framing would get in the way. By the 15-minute mark, it was everywhere. In private group chats, on streaming news tickers, embedded in op-eds that hadn't even been fully written yet. Inside newsrooms, producers barked orders to get the footage on air. On live TV, anchors paused mid-segment to replay the moment, giving it context in real time. Podcasts stripped the audio for their cold opens, letting Jasmine's voice stand alone before fading into music. Even without seeing her, you could picture the scene. The faint rustle of the transcript's pages, the unflinching eye contact, the sentence that cut the air in half. Context isn't decoration, it's meaning. That line became its own current. People clipped just that soundbite and looped it, overlaying it with subtitles, posting it without commentary. Lawyers explained in long threads why it mattered. Civilians with no legal background still understood the core of it. Someone had tried to weaponize a half-truth, and she'd put the missing piece back in place, right where everyone could see it. The elegance of it was that she didn't just correct the record, she dismantled the way the false record had been built in the first place. Everywhere it went, the reaction was visceral. People who had never stepped foot inside a courtroom suddenly felt like they were in that gallery watching the shift happen. They could feel the tension when she looked at the bench, hear the faint scrape of a chair as someone in the gallery leaned forward. The silence before her words hit felt just as important as the words themselves. And in Texas, hundreds of miles away from the Capitol steps, a man sat at a small wooden kitchen table, a half-drunk mug of coffee cooling beside him. The television in the other room had been on all morning, tuned to a channel that mostly played as background noise. He hadn't been watching the trial. He didn't know her name. But then, through the static hum of routine, her voice carried over the sound of clinking dishes and the low murmur of anchors. It was something in the tone, not loud, not pleading, but steady, deliberate. He reached for the remote and rewound. The screen jumped back to the start of the clip. Jasmine standing at the lectern, her finger marking the transcript, her eyes locked forward. He listened all the way through. Then he played it again and again. By the third replay, the coffee was cold. He didn't notice. His eyes were fixed on the screen. On the way, she didn't flinch under the weight of the room. He'd seen plenty of battles in his life, some in the open, some behind closed doors. But this was different. She wasn't fighting with volume or bluster. She was fighting with precision, stripping the heat out of the moment until only the truth was left standing. It struck something in him, a recognition he hadn't felt in years. She was steady, disciplined, not letting the bait of politics pull her into a shouting match. In that moment, she reminded him of the men and women he'd served with, not in what she was wearing or where she was standing, but in the way she carried herself under pressure. He pushed the coffee aside and pulled a lined notepad toward him. The pen in his hand hovered for a moment before he began to write, his handwriting careful, deliberate. "You fought with intelligence and calm," he wrote. "I have seen louder battles, but few as disciplined. Your restraint felt like respect for the oath I once wore." He paused, reading the lines back, and underlined the word respect. Folding the page was slower work than writing it. He smoothed each crease with the flat of his hand before sliding it into an envelope. His name went in the corner, hers in the center. No phone number, no email, just ink, paper, and the weight of what he'd just seen. As he sealed the flap, The television replayed the clip on mute, but he didn't need to hear it. He already knew the words by heart. Outside, the winter air bit at his cheeks as he walked the letter down to the blue steel mailbox at the end of his street. The sound of the envelope sliding into the metal slot was soft, almost nothing. But in that moment, it felt like something had been sent not just to her, but into the current of whatever was moving across the country. Because while that letter made its slow way through the postal system, the clip was still running hot. It had crossed its first 1,000,000 views before the mail truck even reached his block. In classrooms, students watched it projected onto whiteboards. In law firms, it played in small conference rooms between client meetings. In living rooms, it lit up TV screens as people explained to their families what the Hatch Act was and why it mattered. The beauty and the danger of a moment like this was how fast it could move. The clip didn't need a headline to carry it. It didn't need hashtags or celebrity endorsements. It moved because it was undeniable. Even people who disagreed with her politics had to admit the skill of the argument, the command of the room, the way she walked out of the courthouse without claiming a personal victory and instead framed it as something bigger. In one replay after another, you could see the same beat. The question from the press, is this a political victory? And her answer, plain and final, no. This is a victory for the principle of the rule of law. It was the kind of answer that stopped the noise for just long enough to be heard. And once heard, it was the kind of answer people repeated, not because it was catchy, but because it was solid. For the veteran in Texas, that line was the closer. He hadn't needed her to win for him to write the letter. He hadn't needed the verdict to go her way. But hearing her refuse to claim it as a political scalp, that was when he knew the letter had been worth writing. It wasn't about left or right. It wasn't about winning or losing. It was about someone standing in the storm and keeping their footing without turning it into theater. Days later, when the letter would finally be sorted into the stack of envelopes headed her way, the clip would still be moving. It would still be replaying in comment threads, still showing up in news segments, still being used in law school lectures as an example of how to frame an argument with clarity and control. It wasn't just that she had won the case. It was that she had won the moment without letting the moment swallow her. And somewhere in that endless stream of replays, her hand would still be on the transcript, her eyes still steady, her voice still saying the line that cut the case open. Context isn't decoration, it's meaning. For the people who had been in the room, it was the pivot point of the trial. For the people watching through screens, it was proof that even in a world addicted to noise, precision still had the power to stop everything for a heartbeat. The veteran's letter was just one envelope in a nation's worth of reactions. But it was the one that mattered most to him, because in his mind, it wasn't really about her or the case or the courtroom. It was about seeing the thing he'd always believed, that intelligence without calm is reckless, and calm without intelligence is weak. Come together in one moment that didn't just defend the law but honored it. And as the clip kept moving, as more and more people watched that quiet precision play out in a packed courtroom, they weren't just seeing a legal defense. They were seeing what it looks like when someone refuses to let the noise win. The clip kept moving, and the veteran's letter kept traveling. And out of that motion, a larger question surfaced like a shape in slow rising light. What exactly is the lesson when a single steady voice cuts through a room full of noise and changes its temperature? The answer is not about victory laps or enemies humbled. It is about the kind of strength that does not need to raise its volume to raise a standard. A courtroom is built to test stories, and this one taught that facts without context are sparks tossed into dry brush. The human thing, the decent thing, is to bring water, not gasoline, and to let the full sentence stand before a verdict is born. A society that forgets this grows brittle, quick to shatter with every rumor that lands. A society that remembers this grows steady because patience and proof become the default posture instead of suspicion and heat. The deeper current here is that law is not a cudgel for tribes, but a guardrail for everyone on the road. Guardrails do not cheer or boo. They keep the car from leaving the cliff, even when the driver is distracted, angry, or sure they know better. The lesson is not glamorous, but it is fierce. Discipline outlasts spectacle, and clarity outlives spin. Another thread of the lesson runs through a single mark on a page, the ellipsis that once severed meaning and turned a clause into a weapon. That small cut stood in for 1,000 daily cuts people make when rushing to judge a neighbor, a colleague, a stranger whose name appears in a headline. Lives get edited the same way sentences do, with the most complicated parts trimmed because they demand time, curiosity, and humility. The hearing put that habit on trial, and the full sentence restored more than one reputation. It restored a practice. Listening completely is not passive in a storm. It is active, muscular, and unafraid of what the full context might reveal. Classrooms, kitchens, and office break rooms became annexes of that courtroom when the clip played and the pause before the final clause landed. The moment a line returned to its true meaning, a small civic muscle got stronger. The one that says, slow down, check twice, finish the thought. No one needs a robe to practice that. A person needs only the will to hold the frame wide enough to be fair. That is how communities stop bad fires from spreading and how trust slowly grows back. Courage in this story did not arrive as a roar. It arrived as a controlled breath held through pressure. Plenty of people can shout their way to a headline, but headlines are a weak measure of truth, and heat is a poor substitute for light. What mattered was the refusal to play to the crowd, even when the crowd wanted theater more than judgment. There is a stubborn kind of bravery that refuses the easy line and chooses the right one, even if it sounds less dramatic. Institutions do not move because someone speaks louder. They move because someone presents reasons that cannot be dismissed. That is a civic art worth teaching, copying, and celebrating without turning it into worship of one name or one side. The veteran in Texas recognized it immediately because discipline recognizes discipline, and calm recognizes calm even across distance and years. He answered not with a cheer, but with a letter, because respect is still a form of action in a noisy age. The moral terrain shifts when more people pick that form of action, and the noise loses a little ground each time it happens. If there is a map in this moment, it is drawn with quiet lines and held by steady hands. Accountability sits at the center of the lesson, but not the kind sharpened into a spear for partisan hunts. Real accountability is built on standards that do not bend for friends and do not stiffen for foes. Chain of custody on evidence is not a technicality. It is a promise that the truth arrived whole and untampered. Authentication is not bureaucracy. It is a ritual that honors everyone's stake in the outcome. The Hatch Act, named and wielded all morning, is not a net thrown over any statement an official makes. It is a scalpel meant for one careful purpose. When the scalpel becomes a club, the surgery turns into harm, and confidence in the operating room is lost for everyone. The hearing reminded more than lawyers that tools must be used as designed, or the work becomes damage in costume. A nation that loves shortcuts learns to fear mirrors, because mirrors show every cut it took and every cut it gave. The steadier path asks for proofs, asks for context, asks for rules applied the same way even when the spotlight would prefer a twist. That steadiness is slower, but slow is not weak when the cargo is trust. Leadership lessons were braided through the day in ways that had nothing to do with podiums or applause lines. Leadership is a posture before it is a position, and restraint under pressure is its first language. The refusal to claim a personal triumph when a system performs its duty is not modesty for show. It is alignment with purpose. No, this is a victory for the principle of the rule of law. That line carried the weight of service without the perfume of spectacle, and it set a bar that others can actually reach. Officials can learn from it, because public work is not a constant campaign. It is a practice of making room for the law to work even when the result is not sweet. Lawyers can learn from it because precision is not cold when it protects the living world that cases touch. Journalists can learn from it because framing powerfully is not the same as cutting carelessly, and the difference changes lives. Students can learn from it because rigor and fairness are not opposing forces. They are teammates that win slowly but permanently. A culture that teaches these lessons early finds citizens who do not need capes to stand upright when storms come. There is also a lesson about belonging that lives under the legal arguments, a lesson made visible in how the room finally listened. Belonging is not granted by a smirk and revoked by a whisper. It is grounded in equal standing before standards that do not blink. When a judge shifts from condescension to attention, the system breathes closer to how it should breathe every day. That shift did not happen by accident. It happened because evidence met patience and patience met courage. The human heart knows the difference between a show and a reckoning, even if the ear is tempted by applause. Reckonings often look quiet from the outside because the real noise is the sound of ideas snapping into place where posture once stood. A person watching from a couch could feel that click without needing the vocabulary of the law, because fairness has a texture that does not need translation. The veteran's letter carried that texture in ink, and 1,000 unmailed letters carried it in breath, exhaled in small rooms. When a culture values that feeling more than the next viral insult, the public square grows safer for disagreement and sharper for truth. Safety and sharpness are not enemies when they are married to principle. From beginning to end, the story pressed one insistence into the surface of a very loud era. Let truth arrive whole. Whole truth is not an ornament for people who have time. It is the only material strong enough to bear the weight of a shared life. Half-truths are scaffolds that collapse when a real load is placed on them, and those collapses bury bystanders first. The moral lesson here is not sentimental. It carries bruises from the day's blows. Calm does not mean soft, and discipline does not mean dull. Both mean prepared, both mean aimed, both mean ready to hold the line without tearing what stands behind it. A nation that keeps that in mind spends less time repairing damage and more time building rooms where argument can be strong without turning poisonous. The characters on this day will pass from screens in time, but the practices they revive do not have to fade. Listening fully before judging, testing evidence before trusting it, and naming victories carefully so the ground beneath them remains firm. Those are not courtroom tricks, but survival skills for a republic. The clip will slow, the numbers will fall, the headlines will move on, and that is fine. What must not move on is the quiet agreement that made the day matter. When the work is hard and the stakes are high, let the facts stand complete. Let the rules stand equal, and let the dignity of restraint do its work in the open. The noise around the case slowed, the numbers on the clips kept spinning, and yet a smaller sound began to rise. A quiet question that refused to be drowned out. It did not come with a headline or a chant. It came like a steady knock at the door. The lesson had been made plain, the law had done its work, and the crowd had moved on. But the question stayed. It waited in the pause after the replay, in the breath held between sentences, in the small stillness that follows a hard-fought moment. It was the kind of question that walks home with people and sits at their tables. It did not ask for applause, it asked for honesty. It did not ask who won, it asked who stood. It did not demand a speech, it demanded a choice. Under the heat of a day that ran like a movie, the question cut cleaner than any line of dialogue. The question was simple, and it was sharp. What does standing up look like when no one is cheering and no one is holding the door? It looks like refusing the easy headline in your own mind and asking for the whole sentence before you judge. It looks like taking a breath, pulling the frame wide, and checking what was cut out when the clip was made. It looks like saying, "Show me the source," even when the room wants speed instead of proof. It looks like lowering your voice when the crowd raises theirs, because calm is not surrender. Calm is aim. It looks like printing the facts and bringing them to the meeting, even if the room rolls its eyes. It looks like pushing back on half-truths in the family chat without turning the chat into a fight. It looks like telling a coworker, "Let's get this right," when "let's get this fast" would be easier. It looks like holding a line you did not draw for yourself but choose to guard anyway. None of this is glamorous, but every inch of it matters. There is a cost to standing up that the camera never shows, and it starts long before anyone hears your voice. Your throat tightens. Your hands get cold. You feel the tug to sit down, to wait, to let someone else carry the weight of the moment. You can picture the eye rolls, the muttered jokes, the careful distance people keep from anyone who insists on the slow truth. You can hear the one-liners that will follow, the labels that make a person smaller than the stance they took. You can already imagine the silence that greets you after you speak, the way a room goes still not in respect but in calculation. The mind counts risks, a boss's temper, a friend's disappointment, a door that may not open next time. This is the quiet battlefield where most people lose, not because they are weak, but because they are human. And yet this is also the ground where courage grows, because courage is not a roar. It is a steady breath held under pressure. If there is a drill worth learning from the courtroom, it is simple enough to carry in a pocket and strong enough to use anywhere. First, pause. Long enough to let the first rush of heat pass so your next step is chosen, not forced. Second, find the whole sentence. Ask what was cut, when it was cut, and why it was cut. Third, test the chain. Who held the evidence, who touched it, who changed it, and who can say so under oath. Fourth, speak once cleanly. No flourishes, no spikes, no bait taken, just the core of what holds and the core of what fails. Fifth, leave space. Let silence do its work when the point has landed, because piling on is how clarity gets buried. Sixth, stand by the rules you asked for, when they help your side and when they don't, because equal standards are the only kind that last. These 6 beats are not a speech, they are a habit. They work at a town hall, across a kitchen table, in a staff meeting, or in a crowded thread. They turn noise into signal and spectacle into judgment. A different kind of power lives in restraint, and it does not need a parade to prove it is real. Restraint is not the absence of feeling. It is the harness on feeling that lets truth travel without spilling. It does not make a person small, it makes a person steady. It tells a room, we will not confuse volume with value, and then shows the room how to keep that promise. When the answer outside the courthouse was, no, this is a victory for the principle of the rule of law, it was not humility for the cameras. It was alignment with purpose. It said the win did not belong to a name, but to a standard. And standards do not grow by being claimed. They grow by being kept. People remember this more than they remember the heat of the fight, because steadiness is rare, and rare things leave a mark. The veteran in Texas felt it through a screen and answered with ink. Not because ink is dramatic, but because ink is durable. That is how respect moves. Quietly, precisely, unchanged by the weather. Standing up is not just about what you oppose. It is about what you propose to protect. Protect the full sentence from the knife of the ellipsis. Protect the chain of custody from the shortcuts that rot trust from the inside. Protect the difference between governing and campaigning, because that line keeps every office from turning into a stage. Protect equal rules even when unequal rules would favor your side, because a tilted field always tilts back and crushes whoever stands there next. Protect the dignity of disagreement, which is not a soft virtue but a hard discipline, because iron sharpens iron only when both pieces stay intact. Protect the small courtesies, names used with care, time given for answers, records read before reactions, because these are the rails that keep the train on track. Protect the room itself, the shared space where people can bring proof and leave with decisions, not scars. Protect the oath, whether you ever swore one or not, because the country does not live under posts, it lives under promises kept. And when the crowd forgets this, remind them without rage and without apology. The question then turns personal, and there is no way to dodge it without dulling something true inside you. What do you hold when the room is against you, when the clip is cut wrong, when the rumor runs faster than the correction? You hold the pause, you hold the proof. You hold the tone that refuses to trade clarity for noise. You hold the rules even when they seem to slow your side down. You hold the line that belongs to everyone, and you guard it as if a stranger's future depends on it, because it might. You do not wait for applause, because applause is a wind that changes direction without warning. You do not wait for permission, because permission is often the last thing that arrives when truth is under pressure. You do not wait for the perfect words, because perfect is the enemy of present, and present is where the stand must be made. You step up anyway, clean and steady. Some days standing up will mean speaking in a room that would prefer you stayed quiet. Some days it will mean refusing to share a clip that flatters your side but betrays the truth. Some days it will mean asking for receipts from people you love and risking a frown to keep a friendship honest. Some days it will mean telling your own team, we don't do that, and holding the door open for the rule you just defended to walk in and stay. Some days it will mean saying, I don't know, and meaning it, because not knowing is not a sin when knowing requires work. Some days it will mean being the last person to speak and the first person to listen. Some days it will mean walking out of a room with fewer allies and more integrity. Some days it will feel like too much. And some days it will feel like exactly enough. If you want to measure for the stand, do not look for fireworks. Look for friction. The right stand will press against you where it hurts. Pride, speed, certainty, tribe. It will ask you to carry a weight you cannot show off and to keep a promise no one will celebrate. It will make your voice steady when your chest is tight. It will make your hands open when your instinct is to clench them. It will make you choose the long road when the shortcut glitters like a prize. It will cut old habits from your life and stitch stronger ones in their place. It will change not just what you argue, but how you argue. It will make you dangerous to lies and useful to the truth. It will do all of this without audience, and that is the point. There is a line that crosses every room where people gather to decide, and it does not move unless somebody moves it. The line says that facts must arrive whole, that rules must be equal, that words must be kept honest by their neighbors. The line says we will not make theaters out of courts, nor games out of oaths, nor trophies out of the tools that keep a nation upright. The line says a person can lose a point and keep their dignity, or win a point and keep their humility, and either way, the future gets safer for everyone else. The line says we will slow down when the crowd goes fast, not because we fear the crowd, but because we respect the truth. This line is not abstract. It is made of 1,000 small choices stacked end to end. You can see it as it rises, in a transcript laid flat under bright lights, in a voice that refuses to shout, in a question that demands a chain of custody before it concedes a claim. You can see it in the way a room turns from laughter to listening. You can hold it by choosing, again and again, to be the person who stands where the line needs a spine. So the question returns, and this time it does not wait at the door. It steps forward and looks you in the eye. It is not here to flatter or to scold. It is here to invite a promise only you can make. Picture the room as it was before the tide turned. The smirks, the whispers, the heat. Picture the table, the file, the breath you have to steady before you speak. Picture the weight of choosing the rule over the roar. Picture the silence that follows. Now let the question land where choices begin and excuses end. Let it land in the same simple words that carried across marble and glass and screens and streets, because simple words are the ones that stick when the lights go down and the door clicks shut. If you were the one standing there, with no one behind you, no applause in your ears, only the truth in your hands, would you stay silent or would you stand up? Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.